No one expected the storm to begin with a single, unmarked envelope. It arrived on a quiet morning, slipping through the royal postal system like any routine document. But the moment Princess Anne held it in her hands, something in her gut twisted. The wax seal was foreign, the handwriting hauntingly familiar. When she tore it open, her world shifted forever. What lay inside wasn't just information, it was a ticking time bomb carrying the final secret Diana never got to reveal. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began like any other day within the palace walls. The routine of endless documents, letters, and briefings had dulled Anne's instincts long ago. Yet something about this envelope pierced through that monotony. There was no royal crest, no embossed insignia of authority. Instead, a deep red wax seal stared back at her. Its strange design, almost like a silent challenge for a brief moment. She considered passing it off to her private secretary, as she usually did, but something inside urged her to open it herself. Her fingers hovered over the seal, heartbeat quickening, as if some buried part of her already knew this was not another ceremonial note or routine update. She broke the wax cleanly, unfolded the single sheet inside, and froze at first. Her eyes didn't fully register what she was seeing. The sterile header of a private laboratory report sat coldly at the top. Beneath it, familiar words leaped out with brutal clarity. DNA test results. Her gaze swept down the page, and there they were, names she knew as well as her own, Diana Spencer. And below it, another name she had never seen before, foreign to any palace record. The conclusion at the bottom was written in sharp, unambiguous language. There was no room for interpretation, no space for denial. It confirmed a genetic link between Diana and this unknown individual. A chill ran through Anne's body. The polished, predictable world she had lived in suddenly tilted on its axis. Her hands trembled as she reread the conclusion again and again, hoping she had misread it, that perhaps there was a clerical error. But the words didn't change. Each line clawed deeper, revealing something far more dangerous than gossip or scandal. This wasn't tabloid rumor. This was scientific proof. Undeniable and explosive, Anne's mind flooded with questions. Who had sent it? Why now? And most terrifying of all, what did this revelation mean for the royal family? She thought back to Diana's cryptic remarks over the years, the whispered confessions in quiet corners during family gatherings, the way her eyes sometimes carried a weight others dismissed as melancholy. Had Diana been trying to tell her something all along? A knot tightened in Anne's chest as she considered the implications. The monarchy was built on lineage, on the clarity of bloodlines and succession, and this report, if true, struck at the very foundation of that order. It wasn't just personal, it was constitutional, dynastic, explosive. Anne set the paper down slowly, her fingers reluctant to let it go, as if releasing it would make the truth vanish. But it was too late. The truth had already rooted itself in her mind. Whoever sent it had chosen her deliberately. She wasn't just a recipient. She was being entrusted, or perhaps tested, with a secret powerful enough to rewrite royal history. She folded the report carefully, her hands still unsteady, and locked it in her private drawer. Yet even as she turned the key, she knew nothing about her life or the monarchy itself. Would remain untouched by what she had just read. The silence of the palace around her suddenly felt heavier, as though the very walls were holding their breath. She glanced out toward the sprawling gardens, but the beauty outside did nothing to quiet the storm inside her. Anne had always been the steadfast one, the dependable royal, the woman who carried duty with quiet grace. But this was different. This was a revelation too big to bury, and what Anne didn't yet know was that this was only the beginning. Before she could even catch her breath, the shadows of Diana's past began to claw their way to the surface. Diana was many things: beloved princess, global icon, fierce mother, but she was also a woman who left breadcrumbs in places no one thought to look. Long before her tragic end, she suspected that one day, someone would need to follow them. And now, with that DNA report in hand, Anne finally understood the cryptic whispers Diana had scattered through diaries, letters, and quiet confessions. The past wasn't buried. It was waiting. Anne's hands still trembled from the weight of what she had read, but her sharp, unyielding mind began to search for context. She had spent years brushing aside Diana's more enigmatic remarks, dismissing them as emotional turbulence from a woman trapped in a gilded cage. But now, those words returned with haunting clarity. Diana's private diaries, once seen as mere emotional musings, contained lines that suddenly burned with new meaning. Phrases like, "truth too dangerous to speak aloud." Back then, they had seemed dramatic, the venting of a woman exhausted by relentless scrutiny. But against the cold certainty of that DNA report, they became something else entirely. They became evidence. Diana hadn't been exaggerating. She had been warning. Anne remembered vividly the few times she'd glimpsed those diaries. Diana had guarded them fiercely, sharing select passages only in moments of rare vulnerability. She spoke of keeping things safe, of leaving a map for someone who would one day understand at the time. Anne had smiled politely, never realizing that map wasn't metaphorical. It was literal. Letters to trusted confidants, hidden in obscure corners of her estate, holding fragments of a story never meant to be told within palace walls. Letters hinting at betrayal, not of love or politics, but of blood itself. One line, scrawled hastily in the margin of an otherwise tender passage, came back to Anne with chilling clarity. When they are ready, they'll understand. She had once dismissed it as poetic, perhaps meant for William and Harry, but now, with the DNA report echoing in her mind, she realized that they might have meant her, or anyone strong enough to uncover what the monarchy had buried. Anne didn't yet have proof, but deep down she had a sinking feeling she already knew who that someone was. For years, Charles had carried a look she couldn't quite read, something between resignation and restraint. But as the DNA truth closed in, that expression finally made sense. She found him alone, seated in his study, the fire casting long, uneasy shadows across the room. Without a word, she placed the report before him. His reaction wasn't shock. It was something far worse, recognition. In that moment, Anne realized he had been living with this secret for decades. The silence stretched painfully between them. Anne stood across from her brother, the weight of betrayal pressing against her chest. She had expected denial, outrage, even confusion. Instead, Charles stared at the folded report with an unsettling stillness. He didn't reach for it. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. It was as though he already knew exactly what it contained. That quiet acknowledgement cut deeper than any confession could. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker of something she hadn't seen in him for years, a trace of unguarded truth. Raw and weary beneath the polished mask of monarchy, Anne spoke first, her voice low but unwavering, demanding to know what he had hidden and why. Charles didn't interrupt. He didn't attempt to soften his response with formality or charm. When she finished, he exhaled a long, deliberate breath that seemed to carry the weight of history itself. Then, in a tone so composed it was almost chilling, he admitted it. "Yes," he said quietly, "the child was real. Yes, I knew, and yes, the truth was buried after Diana's death." He told her about the secret pact forged in the chaos following Diana's passing, a pact made not out of cruelty, but out of what he called necessity. Those involved had agreed that revealing another heir born outside the traditional structure would unleash a constitutional storm. The monarchy might not survive, so they acted swiftly. Records were sealed. Identities were altered. Evidence erased. A life removed, not through malice, but through methodical calculation. Charles spoke about it not as a crime, but as if he were recounting a matter of state. To him, it wasn't deception. It was preservation. The monarchy, he reasoned, could not withstand another scandal after the chaos of the 1990s. But it wasn't preservation. It was betrayal of Diana, of the child, and of her she had stood by him through every public storm, believing that beneath all the ceremony there remained a core of honesty between them. That illusion now shattered like glass. Her anger surged, fierce, uncontainable. She accused him of sacrificing Diana's truth for the crown, of letting her suffer alone while he stood by, knowing there was more to the story. She reminded him of Diana's haunting warnings that the machine would silence her if she ever pushed too far. And here he was, living proof that the machine had done exactly that. With his silent consent, Charles didn't respond with defense or denial. He simply sat there, eyes lowered, the firelight dancing across his face. It was as if he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, and long accepted his role in it. Finally, he murmured that sometimes duty demanded choices no one could understand, that the survival of the monarchy required sacrifices the world could never know. It was the same cold logic passed down through generations of kings and queens, but hearing it from her brother's lips felt like a blade twisting deep inside her. Anne stared at him. The man she had known all her life, now revealed as the keeper of a truth that could crumble everything their family stood for. The fire's glow couldn't soften what his words had burned into her mind. He had known, he had chosen silence. He had let Diana's final secret fade into the shadows. But if Charles had known, who else had been part of this secret? Who else had helped keep it buried? Camilla, she had survived every royal storm, not by resisting the machine, but by mastering it. Her power came not from titles, but from secrets, and this was the one she had kept closest of all. When Anne confronted her, Camilla didn't flinch. She simply smiled. The measured smile of a woman who had known all along and turned truth into leverage, and entered the room, burning with resolve, still raw from Charles's confession. If anyone else in the palace had known about Diana's hidden child, it was Camilla. She had spent decades weaving herself into the monarchy's core, playing the long game with unnerving precision. Anne laid it all out, the DNA evidence, the missing records, the timeline. But Camilla didn't react with denial or fear. She listened quietly, almost amused, like a strategist watching someone finally discover a game. She'd been winning for years when she finally spoke. Her voice was calm, deliberate, chillingly Yes, she said. She had known. Not from Charles directly, but through whispers, confidants, and her own subtle inquiries. She explained that in the palace, information was never truly hidden, only redirected. She had collected fragments of truth and turned them into silent power. While others floundered through scandal, she built her influence through possession of secrets no one dared expose. And this was her greatest one. Camilla leaned closer, her tone sharp as glass. She revealed that she had used this knowledge as her shield, her unspoken insurance policy. The understanding that she could, at any moment, expose the monarchy's deepest secret made her untouchable. No one dared cross her, while Charles carried the truth as a burden. Camilla wielded it as a weapon. Anne's outrage flared. She accused Camilla of exploiting Diana's pain for personal gain, of turning her tragedy into political currency. But Camilla didn't waver. Instead, she issued a quiet, devastating threat. She reminded Anne that the monarchy's power rested entirely on perception, and perception could be destroyed. Not only by Diana's secret child, but by other truths. Truths about Anne herself, truths about her private life, her relationships, her moments of vulnerability the public never knew. She spoke softly, each word slicing through the air like a blade. Then she tilted her head, her voice taking on that cool, chessmaster tone. "You've always seen this family as duty," she said, "but I see the board. Every move, every piece, and you're just now realizing the game was rigged before you ever learned the rules." Her words weren't loud, but they hit with devastating precision. Then, after a long pause, Camilla added the line that froze and in place. "The child," she said with a glint of quiet certainty, "is not some distant memory. He's alive. And he's closer than you think." The words hung in the air like prophecy. Anne's pulse pounded. This was no longer about the past, it was about the present. The truth wasn't buried. It was living, moving, breathing, determined to uncover more. Anne began to follow the breadcrumbs Diana had left: letters, records, whispers, and foreign archives. She reached out quietly to trusted archivists across Europe. Beyond the monarchy's reach, weeks of discreet searching finally led to a revelation that shook her to the core. A name buried beneath false documents, belonging to a man who had lived for decades under an assumed identity. The name itself was plain, chosen to hide in plain sight. But the birth date, the location, they aligned perfectly with Diana's mysterious absences in the late 1980s. European medical records confirmed it. The birth of a child, lineage left blank. No father listed, no royal markers. Just a child born into secrecy and raised far from the public eye. The palace may have erased him from British history, but beyond its borders, fragments of his existence remained. Old photographs began to surface. When Anne saw the first image, her breath caught. The resemblance was unmistakable. Diana's sharp jawline, her piercing eyes, the same quiet intensity that once captivated the world. Each photograph revealed a man growing into adulthood beneath another name, a man untouched by royal life, yet carrying features that could never be hidden. Then came Diana's letters, her final words of warning and hope. She had written of secret meetings, of someone she called the light I cannot publicly claim. She wrote of protecting him, of keeping him safe, of her fear that truth would destroy him, and realized, with chilling clarity, that Diana had always known he was destined to become more than a hidden figure. He was her living truth, the one thing the crown could never fully silence. The most shocking revelation came next. He knew. Letters exchanged between him and one of Diana's confidants revealed he had long understood who he was. He had chosen silence, not out of fear, but out of loyalty to his mother, who had sacrificed everything to shield him from the monarchy's weight. He had lived free of titles and expectation, but the blood in his veins made him the most dangerous person in Britain. His very existence could unravel centuries of royal order. Anne sat in silence as the realization sank in. This wasn't a ghost from the past. This was a living storm, and it was heading straight for the crown. It pushed her closer to a truth too monumental to ignore. This was no longer a quiet investigation. It had become a reckoning that bridged history and the present. And then came the moment no one believed possible. He stepped out of the shadows, not as a rumor, but as a living heir carrying Diana's blood and her unfulfilled rebellion in his veins. For years, she had been the family's steady hand, the silent backbone of tradition. But nothing could have prepared Princess Anne for the weight of looking into this man's eyes, eyes that mirrored her beloved sister-in-law's. In that instant, decades of royal lies, hidden grief, and unspoken loyalty collided. She didn't just see a man. She saw Diana's unfinished story, and it shattered her. The meeting was arranged in absolute secrecy. No aides, no courtiers, no official record. For Anne, this wasn't politics, it was personal. When he entered the room, introductions were unnecessary. The resemblance struck her like a blow. His gaze carried Diana's warmth, her unspoken sadness, and a quiet strength that demanded recognition. For a moment, neither spoke. It was as if time folded in on itself, bringing the whispers of the past face to face with the living present. Anne, who had spent her entire life defending the monarchy's line, suddenly felt something far greater than duty pressing upon her chest. He began to speak, his voice calm but edged with years of restrained truth. He told her of his childhood, abroad, a life lived in deliberate obscurity, far from cameras, titles, and expectations. He explained how, as a young man, he began piecing together the fragments of his identity. Letters from Diana, passed to him through trusted intermediaries, revealed who he truly was. She had never abandoned him. Instead, she had built a quiet bridge between their worlds through words, guidance, and love unspoken. His life had been one of distance and silence, watching from afar as his mother's image was elevated, dissected, and repackaged by the very family that had chosen to erase him. He lived in the shadows of headlines about brothers who didn't know he existed, bound to a legacy by blood but denied by history. Anne listened in silence as he recalled the moments that defined his exile. The first time he saw a photograph of his half-brothers and recognized his own reflection in their faces, the coded phrases in Diana's letters that only made sense years later. And finally, the day he received undeniable proof of his lineage. His voice trembled only once when he spoke of the night Diana died. He had been told only fragments then, but years later he came to understand what was truly stolen from him, not just a mother, but a chance to belong. Anne felt something shift deep within her. She realized Diana had trusted her more than anyone to one day uncover the truth. The diaries, the cryptic letters, the breadcrumbs scattered across time, each one was left for someone like Anne to find. She understood, with painful clarity, that this wasn't just a historical revelation, was a personal reckoning. For years, she had placed loyalty to the crown above all else, believing her duty was to preserve stability. But now, sitting across from this man, she saw not a threat, but a human being carrying the weight of his mother's untold story. Emotion overtook her. The woman known for her composure felt tears rise as he spoke not of titles, but of longing. He didn't want power or recognition. He only wanted to be acknowledged, not as a prince, not as a scandal, but simply as Diana's son. The flood of buried truths broke through Anne's lifelong walls. She wept openly, her royal composure dissolving into something raw and human. In that moment, Anne's loyalty fractured. The weight of tradition could no longer outweigh the truth of blood and love. She looked him in the eyes and made a promise, not as a royal, but as Diana's sister. As a woman who finally understood what had been hidden, she vowed that Diana's truth would not die in silence, that the story buried beneath royal control would one day be heard. It was a promise that would change everything, because keeping it meant one thing. Anne would have to challenge the monarchy itself. The world had always seen the royal family as untouchable, but on that day, before cameras and a stunned global audience, Princess Anne shattered the silence. Standing beside the man the world never knew existed, she uttered words that rewrote royal history. The DNA test had spoken. Diana's final secret was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. For Anne, the decision hadn't come easily. It was forged in sleepless nights and quiet reckonings. She knew defying Charles and Camilla meant stepping beyond the boundaries that had defined her entire life. Yet after meeting Diana's son and making that promise, there was no turning back. The weight of truth pressed on her like a crown of thorns. She had seen what silence had done to Diana Howe. The palace's walls had smothered her voice until only diary echoes remained. Anne refused to let that happen again. So, in a move no one foresaw, she arranged a private press briefing and sanctioned, unfiltered, entirely her own. When the world's media received the invitation, speculation ignited like wildfire. Why Anne? Why now? The palace scrambled to contain it. Charles tried to reason. Camilla issued veiled threats, but Anne had reached a point where fear no longer dictated her choices. She arrived at the briefing with Diana's son, by her side not as a secret to be hidden, but as a truth to be declared. The packed room fell silent as she began to speak. Her words were calm, deliberate, and devastatingly clear. She confirmed the DNA test. She revealed the years of concealment. And she introduced the man standing beside her as Diana's son, the living embodiment of the story. The monarchy had buried. The reaction was instant and seismic. Headlines erupted across the globe. Networks cut broadcasts to air her every word. Parliament descended into chaos as experts debated the line of succession. Across the Commonwealth, shockwaves rippled through nations that once saw the monarchy as unbreakable. For the first time in generations, that illusion cracked before the world's eyes. This wasn't a whispered scandal, it was a reckoning. Unfolding live and unstoppable. Inside the palace, the fallout was immediate. Camilla's quiet grip of control began to crumble. Her influence, built on fear and silence, could no longer contain the storm. Charles stood cornered, his decades of complicity exposed under the blinding light of truth. The very institution he'd sought to protect now faced its greatest legitimacy crisis in modern history. The royal image was no longer theirs. To control it belonged to the people, watching, judging, reacting. And then came the moment, replayed millions of times around the world. Diana's son stepped forward. His statement was brief, but every word landed like thunder. He didn't beg for recognition or power. He spoke with quiet strength, declaring Diana his mother without apology. Without hesitation, he thanked Anne for her courage, acknowledged a lifetime of silence, and made it clear he sought no titles, no throne, only truth. He would no longer live in the shadows of history. His existence was no longer a rumor, was reality. The room erupted, reporters shouting questions, flashes blinding, but Anne had said all she needed to. Her promise was fulfilled. The palace gates that had guarded secrets for decades were finally open, and the world looked inside. The monarchy, once immovable, now stood at a crossroads between preservation and transformation. The world would never see the royal family the same way again. But as the cameras dimmed and silence fell, one question lingered. What role would Diana's son play now that the truth was finally free?